So, one of the oldest interactive jokes in our history is the knock-knock joke. Knock-knock jokes are one of the oldest jokes, and they show up as early as the 1930s in American history. But there's also a folklore that claims that Shakespeare invented the knock-knock phrase as found in Macbeth, which goes back to 1606, actually. Now, you can probably think of all kinds of knock-knock jokes, right? But one of my favorite ones is one that I think I did with my oldest, and apparently I traumatized her, because I forgot that she has, well, I'll explain after. So there's this, it goes, knock, knock, who's there? Interrupting cow, moo, right? And I just kind of did that moo a little bit too loud. And I forgot that my daughter actually doesn't like the moo sound. And she was a little toddler when I did that. And she still remembers. It's like, Daddy. Because I was asking her this week, I was like, hey, do you remember that interrupting cow knock knock joke? She's like, didn't you tell me about it? She's like, no, that wasn't me. You did it to me. And I'm like, oh, that's right. And so she was reminding me of that interruption of the moo really startled her, apparently. So, the reason why I share with you about this interrupting cow is that interruptions are what happens when we're in the middle of a flow of something, like a conversation. We're in a conversation and we get interrupted. But it disrupts the rhythm of the conversation, but it's an interruption, so it's small, and then you can go back to the conversation. At a school, when you're in class and in instruction, an announcement might come over the PA system. The principal might get on the PA system and do a brief announcement, but then as soon as the announcement's done, class resumes as it had been going. Or maybe you're in the middle of a conversation over dinner at a restaurant, and the server comes by and quickly asks if you need anything else, how's the food? It's a brief interruption, and then you go back to your conversations. Interruptions are just a moment. But this week, as I was thinking about that, there's a difference between an interruption and a disruption. Disruptions are different. Disruptions don't take us back to business as usual. Disruptions don't help us get back, don't bring us to a space of going back to what we had just been doing. I'll give you an example. In the business and supply chain world, an interruption could simply be that maybe there's a short-term challenge like an equipment malfunction or staffing shortages, and so there's a temporary delay perhaps, but they don't fundamentally alter operations. But on the other hand, when you have some major disruptions, major events like a pandemic or cyber attacks or geopolitical changes and shifts that cause like sequential cascading effects into the functioning of how we do things, and they force long-term or permanent operational changes, it may radically change the way things are done, and therefore it affects how we do our day-to-day life. It may even affect the way that you manage your finances as a result of it. And you may notice some of these things in current events in our world today. You may see the reverberating effects in your grocery bill. Or you stop at the gas station. The other day I stopped by the gas station and I was like, right? If you've been to the gas station recently, it probably get you like, what? I didn't realize how much gas is going up. And perhaps it disrupts the way you think about and practice your financial management as well. This past week as well, it's one thing for a principal to get on a PA system. It's a whole other thing where, at least where my kids go to school in Loudoun County Public Schools, they had school on the day that there was a tornado warning, right? I know Fairfax County's like, there's going to be early dismissal and all that stuff. But Loudoun County, they just had school. They had school the entire day. But in the middle of school, they had shelter in place. They did the whole real deal. And my kids started texting me, the lights are flickering. We're all out in the hallway. We got our heads down. This isn't really cool at all. And realized that actually had a very profound impact on the way instruction happened in school, but also had an even bigger impact on the conversations that followed. A lot of students were deeply impacted by that experience because it wasn't feeling like a drill anymore. It felt really real. Disruptions don't just pause the moment. It changes a lot of things. It shifts the environment and sometimes changes the entire system. Now today we're talking about, we're continuing in our sermon series, Jesus Table, and we're looking at these stories of transformation. And today's story is about a major disruption that Jesus does that challenges the very system by which table socializing happens. It changes and it disrupts the way that the social norms and the religious norms of that table interaction takes place. So we take a look at the Gospel of Luke chapter 14. And in the Gospel of Luke chapter 14, it's one story with three parts in it. The first thing that happens in this story is a healing. And the second thing that happens in this story is that there's a redefinition of honor. And the third thing that happens is a redefinition of belonging. And we're going to read this. It's a little long, but let's read this together and let's go through this. It's Luke chapter 14, verse 1 through 24. This is what it says. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to share a meal in the home of one of the leaders of the Pharisees, they were watching him closely. A man suffering from an abnormal swelling of the body was there. Jesus asked the lawyers and Pharisees, "Does the law allow healing on the Sabbath or not?" But they said nothing. Jesus took hold of the sick man, cured him, and then let him go. He said to them, "Suppose your child or ox fell into a ditch on the Sabbath day. Wouldn't you immediately pull it out?" But they had no response. When Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, he told them a parable. When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, don't take your seat in the place of honor. Someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give your seat to this other person." Embarrassed, you will take your seat in the least important place. Instead, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. When your host approaches you, he will say, "Friend, move up here to a better seat." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up. Then Jesus said to the person who had invited him, "When you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers and sisters, your relatives, or rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, and you'll be blessed because they can't repay you. Instead, you'll be repaid when the just are resurrected." When one of the dinner guests heard Jesus' remarks, he said to Jesus, "Happy are those who will feast in God's kingdom." Jesus replied, "A certain man hosted a large dinner and invited many people. When it was time for the dinner to begin, he sent his servant to tell the invited guests, 'Come, the dinner is now ready.' One by one, they all began to make excuses." Oh, by the way, these invitations are usually sent out way in advance, and they've already been RSVP'd. So this is a change in their decision. So one by one, they all began to make excuses. The first one told him, "I bought a farm and must go and see it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I bought 5 teams of oxen and I'm going to check on them. Please excuse me." Another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." When he returned, the servant reported these excuses to his master. The master of the house became angry and said to his servant, "Go quickly to the city streets, the busy ones and the side streets, and bring the poor, crippled, blind, and lame." The servant said, "Master, your instructions have been followed, and there is still room." The master said to the servant, "Go to the highways and back alleys and urge people to come in so that my house will be filled. I tell you, not one of those who are invited will taste my dinner." Amen. That's a lot. And it's so rich. And there's so much happening here. To set the scene, Jesus is invited to the dinner at the house of not just a Pharisee, but a leader of the Pharisees. This is an important dinner. This is a formal setting. And as a leader of the Pharisees, the leader represents something, represents a system, a religious way of engagement, a certain culture. There are high expectations. It's not a casual meal. This is a controlled environment. It's a religious table, a social table. Again, a system. And Luke tells us something very important. It says, they were watching him closely. Everyone knows how this works. This is a space where Jesus is being tested. Who belongs, who matters, where to sit, how to behave, all those things are in the equation here. So Jesus walks in. And when Jesus walks in, he begins this holy disruption in this space. And in the setting of the story, it's not just at the house of the leader of the Pharisees, but it's on the Sabbath day. And that's important too. Because the way that first century Jewish people observed Sabbath day under the influence of the Pharisees was that it was really down to the letter of the law. It was very granular in the way that they nitpicked at the very tiniest, littlest little detail. So Jesus is invited to the home of one of these leaders of the Pharisees. And it's really actually a setup. It's a setup because the Pharisees and Sadducees would always argue about how to interpret the law. And the way this is set up is that as Jesus walks in, it says that they were watching him and that there was a man who was sick. And that the question is, what is Jesus going to do? What is Jesus going to do in the backdrop of this religious system where following the rules and how you follow the rules and how you understand the rules makes all the difference on whether you are acceptable to God? Not just, hey, do we like you? Are you part of our in crowd? No, this is about their understanding of whether you're acceptable to God and whether you're acceptable to their religion and their social context. So Luke again points out they're watching him closely. And there happens to be a man suffering from an abnormal swelling of the body. One commentary is suggesting that the Pharisees purposely, intentionally planted this sick man to be there, to test him, to set up a trap. The irony of all of this is that people who had illness, people who had some kind of a physical differing situation than a lot of the other folks, they were oftentimes in this religious system considered unclean or people that you don't want to associate with. They were considered taboo socially and religiously. Some people would even associate these challenges or these problems with thinking maybe this person committed a sin and therefore they're suffering with whatever illness that they have. And then to associate with these people who are sick and not well was a social and religious taboo. So the irony of this is that the Pharisees have set this up and they would themselves never associate with this, but they've set it up in this house. And they're creating this scenario as a trap, a sabotage. They're setting up this trap. Now, I'm a Star Wars fan, so as I'm watching this, I'm reading this, I can't help but hear Admiral Akbar say, "It's a trap!" Right? Something really bad is about to happen right now. But there it is. Jesus is walking into a trap. He walks into this trap and they want to corner him and see what he's going to do. And then if he breaks the law, then they can accuse him of violating the law. And then that would be reason to do some kind of a punishment, some kind of either arresting him or punishing him, something. So in that space, Jesus doesn't back down. I love how Jesus, in the most controversial and difficult space, he still yet finds a way to do what is right. So then he asks the question, does the law allow healing on the Sabbath or not? And the Pharisees are silent. They don't want to say something that will be used against them. So Jesus doesn't wait. Jesus takes action. He takes a hold of this sick man, heals him, and then lets him go. Then he turns to the Pharisees and he says, suppose your child or your ox were to fall into a ditch on the Sabbath day. What is he doing here? He's drawing on their compassion. He's taking theoretical. Do you ever have an argument with, if you've ever done debate in school, if you ever had an argument with people, a lot of times there are people who just love to stay in the head space, the theoretical, abstract space, and you could say a million things in that space. But the moment you make it personal, the moment you make it about their own story, it changes. And that's what Jesus is doing. He's saying, hey, let's stop pretending here. Let's stop making this about a theoretical argument back and forth. We can go forever about here. But if your kid were to be stuck in a ditch on the Sabbath day, how would you interpret the law? Would you say, we'll wait till tomorrow. We'll wait till tomorrow when the Sabbath ends, but you've kind of figured it out until then. And he's calling them out on that. And they know he's right. So they stay silent. Their ego is greater than their willingness to admit that they are wrong. And they know that Jesus is speaking the truth. The religious system says you belong if you are whole, if you're put together, if you meet the standards. And Jesus is saying you belong simply because you need healing. Whatever you think is your lack, whatever you think is a challenge or a problem in your life, whatever it is, that actually qualifies you to belong with me. It's so contrary to the way that we think in our culture, where we think we got to be put together in order to belong. And Jesus is saying it's the opposite. Come with all that you have, especially the stuff that makes you feel like you're not part of belonging in other spaces. Come with that. In our culture, especially we see it on social media, we curate our lives. We hide our struggles. We present our best selves. But at Jesus' table, your need, your lack, your flaws, your sickness, your ailments, your hurts, none of these are disqualifications ever. And those are actually the reasons why you are welcomed at the table of Jesus. The second disruption that Jesus does is Jesus disrupts the idea of what honor means. What it means to be positioned right. What it means to be successful, and what it means to be recognized. Jesus is watching as the guests all show up and they all start taking seats, positioning them to where they think they should be sitting. In that world, in first century Judaism, and actually Greco-Roman culture as well, the idea is that there was actually a hierarchy to how people sat at formal dinner settings. So the seatings would be like, whether it's cushions or whatever seating, would be done in sort of a horseshoe shape. It's called a triclinium. And the host would be at one end of the table. And in descending order, you would have positions of privilege and honor, and it would go in descending order. So the person sitting the furthest away from the host was the person of least honor. And so Jesus is watching the people walk in, and they're finding their seats around this triclinium. And what Jesus says is super disruptive. You could imagine that people walking in think that they are some kind of a value. In fact, the word honor in Greek is a word called time, which means value and price. So Jesus sees this happening and uses the example of a wedding feast where guests arrive, assume that they have the seats of honor, and Jesus then calls out the guests in the dinner party, saying, don't assume that you, by your own self-manufacturing or whatever definition, that you have some kind of worthy and value that places you in the seat of honor. That's something that the host decides, not you. And what Jesus does in a very subversive way is also saying that the math that Jesus has for calculating honor is not based on how religious you are, how spiritual you are, how moral you are, how well put together you are. No, the scandal of Jesus is that he will take the most unqualified person in the room and sit them closest to him. In fact, at the Last Supper, do you know who sits in the seat of honor? Judas sits in the seat of honor at the Last Supper. It is a remarkable thing that Jesus does, where he will seat the person that you think is the most unqualified in the place of honor. Next to him, left and right, he has John, the one that is considered the disciple who Jesus loved, and then the betrayer. The ones closest sitting next to him at the Last Supper. Why? Because for Jesus, it's not a hierarchy. For Jesus, it's an equalized table. No matter who you are, what you bring to the table, and how you've come to the table, Jesus wants to make sure that on the whole spectrum of the most loved to the most betraying person, that they get to sit right next to Jesus. And that is the scandal of who Jesus is. I remember a while back, Matt was leading us in worship, and one of the things that he said that really stayed with me was he said, the mark of a Christian is not that we love Jesus, but that we're able to love Judas. And I was like, oh, that just hits. That's hard. That's hard. And that's Jesus for us. The longer I live my life, the more mistakes that I make, the more foolish choices that I take, and sometimes really the outright wrongful decisions that I have done. I come to an increasing understanding of how much in my human flesh I lack, and how frail I am, and how much brokenness I hold to, how judgmental I could be, how self-righteous I can be, how messed up I can be, how faulty I can be. The longer I live, the more life scenarios I face, the more I just look into my life. I see it all. And maybe you see that too. And this is contrary to our culture, where we focus in on everything good that we can offer. The best we have, the best foot forward, our resume, the best of our abilities. And in that space, we miss it. We miss it. We miss what Jesus is showing us. Well, first, always there's going to be someone better. And there's always something we're going to lack. And how much I am a recipient of great grace. It's such a trap sometimes to see myself, I'm trying so hard, I'm really trying to be a good person, giving my best to the people around me and giving all the love that I can have. I'm offering it to the world around me. And in that space, it's so easy to think that I'm somebody who only needs a little bit of grace because I'm all right and I'm doing good and I'm committed to the good things. But I forget, and maybe you do too, that the measure of grace that Jesus gave me is not a little bit of grace, but it's a tremendous measure of grace that cost the life of Jesus. And when I think about that, when I sit on that, and at the same time I'm aware of the real depth of my lack and my frailty, in that reality, I am left speechless and humbled. And I'm able to then look at the next person and see them the way Jesus sees them, as just as honorable, just as worthy of the life of Jesus. And yes, even that person that really irks you in the wrong way, that really messes with you, that hurts, it just is get anger, and it's just really hard. And you may ever get into that space. Maybe you're more sanctified than me, but you may get into that space where you look at them and say, I think Jesus spilled more blood for you than for me. You know, I think you're more messed up, so you need Jesus more than me. But you know, no, Jesus, the same blood, the same life, the same Son of God, given for you and me, fully, completely, to save us, to heal us, to restore us, and remind us that we are all infinitely worthy because of him. And that gospel truth. And not only did Jesus do that with the cross, but he was raised from the dead, and the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, scriptures teach us, is the same Spirit that is at work in us. The person sitting next to you, across from you, your next door neighbor, the person that you struggle with the most in life, that same measure of grace has been given to you and to that person. And Jesus is teaching us that at his table. The third disruption that Jesus brings to us is that belonging is not transactional. Belonging is not transactional. The least expected person gets invited. And Jesus uses the example, invite people who can never pay you back. Because that's what Jesus does. Jesus does not have an expectation for us to pay him back. In fact, we can't. There's nothing we can do to pay him back. There's nothing we can do. If we were to put it on a scale, there's nothing we can do to measure it all the way up to what Jesus has done for us. And so it's not transactional. And so Jesus is saying at this table, just send out invitations to all the people, especially those that society has labeled as unwanted. And that's why it's labeled the way that it is in this text. At Jesus' time, the people that is listed in this story are the ones that were considered outcast. And Jesus is saying, bring them all in. I don't care if they can't pay for their meal. I don't care if they can never host me back again. Bring them in. Bring them in. So we just sang the song, God, I'm just grateful. I'm lifting both of my hands. You gave me chance after chance after chance. I'm just so grateful for you. Because, and the word grateful means God's grace works well. You're saying, God, your grace just works so well. And I'm just thankful. And that's the third disruption. But the final disruption, the real true disruption of this story that gets me, is that Jesus walks in as a guest and he becomes the host. Jesus enters as a guest and becomes the host. Jesus is the true host. In the space of this religious system, he flips it and he says, no, that's not how we're going to do it. He's saying to all the people gathered there, he's saying, you may have a system which you pick and choose who gets to belong on the basis of performance. But let me tell you about my table. And at my table, performance is not the basis for belonging. It's identity. You're a beloved child of God, period. So we need to stop in our own practice of faith, of trying to self-position ourselves. Am I worthy? Am I in? Am I out? Like that. And just instead, look at Jesus and know that we're already in We belong to him forever. Rachel Held Evans wrote this. This is what God's kingdom is like. A bunch of outcasts and oddballs gathered at a table, not because they are rich or worthy or good, but because they are hungry, because they said yes, and there's always room for more. And that's the picture of the church. We need disruptive things to happen in ways that really reflect God's inclusive, inviting grace for all people. And if that does not happen, we don't step into pictures that look more and more like heaven. This year is actually the 70th anniversary of the ordination of women in the Methodist Church in America. 70th anniversary. 1956 was when women were first ordained in the Methodist Church in America. And how did we get there? It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen because, one day someone woke up and said, hey, I've got this great idea. Let's include the women in ordination of clergy. No, it happened because there were people who really believed that we're going to disrupt the social norms. We're going to disrupt the interpretations of Scripture in a way that help us really see the way that the final picture is really going to look like. And in the final picture, women are included. So let's get that straight. And so they fought for it. They fought for it, and they kept creating disruptions in the way that the church functioned until we finally made that decision. There were holy disruptors who paved the way for this to become our present reality. There were people who were saying it's not okay until women have full clergy rights as men. And granted, there are many hurdles that still are in the way in trying to figure out what that actually really, really looks like. But it's happened because of holy disruptions that say this is not right yet. And that helps us understand and ask the question, what else does this need to look like? What else is it going to look like in the very end of all things where it doesn't look like that yet and we need to change? Recently, my number 3 daughter called me from school. My number 3 daughter is on the autism spectrum, and she calls me from time to time from school. Sometimes it's a good thing, but oftentimes she calls because she's very distressed. This time she called me and she was very upset. She's crying on the phone, and I didn't quite understand exactly what she was upset about, because when sometimes people are very distressed, you can't hear the language that's being used. But after all the dust settled, what I came to understand is that at the lunch table, she's in middle school, at the lunch table, she likes to sit with the popular kids. And she also likes to sit with kids who are typically not popular. And those children happen to be also in her special ed classroom. She has a lot of diversity in her setting, with differing abilities and different kinds of needs. And in her mind, all kids should, across any spectrum of development, should all be able to sit together. And she was deeply upset because when she got to the cafeteria that day, the kids, that table where you've got all the kids together, they weren't sitting at the same table that day. One group of kids were at a different table, another kids were at another table. So she walked up to both tables and said, hey, why don't we all sit together? And for whatever reason, they didn't want to be together. So she didn't make a scene. She quietly got up, took her lunch, and went to this particular classroom she gets to go to if she was ever feeling not so good, and with her teacher. And she, there in that safe space, she processed it all out and called me. And the next day, after we all talked it through, apparently she went back to school. And when she went to school, it was lunchtime again. She went with her teacher. She gathered all of them together in one table. And she said, from now on, we all have to sit together. Because that's what friends do. Doesn't matter. We're just going to do that. Apparently, they're like, okay, right? I learned a lot from that conversation that day. She was doing wholly disruptive work. She was stepping into a space, whatever capacity that she had. Once she was able to emotionally collect herself and figure out her action plan, she was able to go in and really advocate for what she believed was right. It's a wholly disruptive work that we do when we model and try to build communities that look more like what Jesus wants it to look like, what Jesus says it's going to look like one day. And sometimes we have to fight for it. Sometimes we have to stand for it because it matters that much. And our faith needs to reflect that. We can't, in good conscience, sit and say, I believe in Jesus, but not advocate for the things that Jesus wants it to look like. And that's part of our faith journey. At the beginning of the school year, as my daughter advanced to middle school, I remember as we were preparing for all of this and figuring out her bus ride and everything, she's always taken the special ed bus. She said to me, "Daddy, I'm not going to take the special ed bus anymore." I'm like, "I'm really sorry, sweetie. That's not an option." She's like, "Well, you're going to have to make it an option." I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I don't even know if this is possible." And I remember going into a meeting and trying to figure this thing out. The world that I grew up in many years ago, I never saw the special ed kids in school. They were in a different hallway. They were in a different cafeteria, different things. But through my daughter, I'm learning, she's saying, no, not going to happen. She rides the general ed bus now because she advocated for it and said, I need to be around other people. And she gives me a picture of what heaven needs to look like on earth. So friends, I want to invite you to think about in your own life, what is Jesus calling you to do? Starting with the space where you and we were once rejected, outcast, and unqualified. Whatever that space might be, we all have it. We all have areas of our lives in which we may feel like we don't belong. Maybe it's a space where you used to belong, but you don't anymore because something has changed. But something in your life, an area where you feel like you're unqualified, that in that space that you would hear Jesus' call in your life, that you are at his table, invited, accepted, and qualified no matter what. Extend Jesus' table to someone this week. Who is in your life that is experiencing a distance from the church? Who in your life is someone who has a narrative about Jesus where I got to get my act together before I show up? Who in your life has a thought that God won't accept me? God won't forgive me for that? We all have people in our lives that are wrestling with that question. Another way to put it is, who in your life is not at the table of Jesus yet because they have the wrong understanding? Who are the hurt, the skeptical, the ones who left the church, the ones who don't trust the church among your friends and your family? I'm not asking you to go out and make new friends, although that's a great thing to do. I'm just simply inviting you to think about people who are already in your life, who need that invitation. A great opportunity is Easter or Holy Thursday. Who will you invite? Will you? And will you make space and extend the table so that whomever it is that you're thinking of right now will know that the table of Jesus is for them too? So at our tables, at the tables of restoration, let's be yielded to holy disruptions. And let's allow Jesus to do what Jesus does best. He's still disrupting so that everyone can belong. Amen.